If you thought Henry VIII was wild, wait until you hear about the princes who came before and after him, because their stories didn't just shape England, they shaped Henry himself. Crazy, right? Let's see. Everyone knows Henry as the king who broke from Rome, created the Church of England, and basically strong-armed history into bending his way. But here's the part almost nobody talks about: Henry's obsession with heirs, his paranoia, his desperate need for control. All of it traces back to two princes most people barely remember today: Arthur Tudor, Henry's older brother, the original Prince of Wales, the boy who was supposed to be king, the boy whose death shoved young Henry onto a throne he never prepared for. And then there's Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son, the child who inherited not just a crown, but the spiritual, political, and emotional wreckage Henry left behind. A kid king trying to rule a kingdom still smoldering from his father's chaos. Here's the shocker: one prince died before he ever truly lived. One became king before he even understood power, and together their short, fragile lives rewired the destiny of England. If Arthur had lived, Henry might never have been king. If Edward had survived, England might be a completely different country today. Wild to think, two boys, one gone too soon, one crowned too early, held that much influence. Do you think so? So tell me, could these two princes have shaped history more than Henry VIII himself? Drop your guess, hit follow, and stick around. This story goes deeper than you think. Before Henry VIII became the storm that shattered England's religious world, there was another prince standing in the spotlight: Arthur Tudor, the first Prince of Wales of the Tudor dynasty, the golden promise after the bloody Wars of the Roses. From the moment he was born, people whispered that Arthur was the child of destiny, the boy who would restore peace and secure the brand new Tudor line. Imagine growing up with a crown practically hovering over your crib. Heavy, right? Do you think any kid could breathe under that kind of weight? Arthur was trained like the perfect Renaissance prince, educated, disciplined, molded into the future King England desperately needed. And his political marriage to a young Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, was meant to seal England's alliances and stabilize the realm. A royal fairy tale on paper, but history had other plans. Because that marriage, short-lived and seemingly insignificant, became the fuse that later blew Henry VIII's world apart. Let's see. When Arthur died at just 15, everything collapsed. Catherine was left a widow. The alliance wobbled, and Henry the carefree spare was suddenly yanked forward as the unexpected heir. Arthur's death didn't just reshape a family, it rewired the entire future of the Tudor crown. Fast forward a generation and another boy carries the impossible burden of destiny: Edward VI. Henry VIII's long-awaited son. After years of miscarriages, heartbreaks, and political panic, Edward's birth felt like a miracle. The whole nation saw him as proof that the Tudor line and the new Protestant England Henry built would survive. Edward wasn't raised like a regular prince. He was crafted into a symbol, a living manifesto for the future of the English Church. A child expected to finish what his father started, even if he barely understood the world around him. And here's the haunting thread that ties them all together: Arthur shaped Henry, Henry shaped Edward, and none of them lived the life they were meant for. Three princes, three destinies broken or bent by the weight of a crown. Makes you wonder, does the crown make the prince, or does it destroy him? What do you think? If you think the Tudor saga is just Henry VIII swinging swords and breaking marriages, oh, you're missing the real drama. Because the conflict didn't start with Henry. It started with Arthur the Prince, who never got the chance to be king. Arthur Tudor carried the weight of being Prince of Wales before he was even old enough to understand what a kingdom was. The crown wasn't his dream, it was his assignment. And before he turned 16, he was already married off to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess with two empires resting on her shoulders. Two teenagers, barely adults, forced into a marriage designed to keep Europe from exploding. Do you think any good comes from that kind of pressure? Let's see. Then came the infamous question everyone still debates: what really happened on their wedding night? Arthur said one thing, Catherine swore another, and that tiny spark of doubt, just a single night wrapped in mystery, became the excuse Henry VIII used years later to break from Rome. Arthur didn't live long enough to know it, but the first domino had already fallen. When Arthur died, Henry was shoved into a destiny he never prepared for. The spare became the heir, and that unwanted responsibility twisted him. His fear of failing the dynasty turned into an obsession. He had to produce a Prince of Wales. No excuses, no compromises, and that obsession landed squarely on the shoulders of his only son, Edward VI. Edward became king at 9, a child surrounded by adults who pulled the strings while he wore the crown. He had the title, but not the power, and his health fragile from day one. England held its breath every time he coughed. Yet, despite his age and weakness, Edward pushed Protestant reforms harder than anyone before him. So hard that it threatened Mary, his own half-sister and the lawful heir. A religious time bomb ticking beneath a king who should have been in school, not ruling a nation. Here's the truth: Arthur's death created Henry's desperation. Henry's desperation created Edward's burden. Three princes trapped by the same expectation produced the next Prince of Wales, and each one paid the price for the last. Kind of tragic, right? Or inevitable? What do you think? Arthur never lived long enough to wear the crown, but his shadow loomed over England for decades. His death turned a teenage tragedy into a constitutional crisis because suddenly the future of an entire dynasty rested on a boy who had been raised to be expendable. Henry wasn't groomed to rule, he was groomed to support. And when that support became the centerpiece, it warped him. The fear of becoming another lost prince haunted Henry for the rest of his life. Every failed pregnancy, every stillbirth, every daughter instead of a son felt like history threatening to repeat itself. That's why Henry didn't just want an heir, he needed one. Desperately. And that desperation poisoned everything. It justified annulments, executions, religious revolution. The Church of England wasn't born purely from theology. It was born from anxiety, the terror of a dynasty ending the way Arthur's life did, suddenly, silently, unfinished. By the time Edward VI arrived, he wasn't just a child. He was a solution, a symbol, a fragile answer to years of fear. But solutions built on fear rarely last. Edward inherited a kingdom mid-transformation, still bleeding from Henry's choices. He was crowned too young, ruled by councils, and driven by religious ideology he barely had time to question. His reign accelerated change instead of stabilizing it, pushing England further down a path that guaranteed backlash the moment he was gone. And when Edward died at 15, almost the same age as Arthur, the cycle snapped shut. Another prince gone too soon, another future erased. So maybe the real Tudor story isn't about Henry at all. Maybe it's about the princes who never got the chance to grow old. The boys who carried England's hopes, fears, and politics on shoulders that were never meant to bear that weight. Arthur, Edward, even Henry himself once. History remembers the king, but it was the princes who paid the price. History doesn't always turn on the famous kings. Sometimes it turns on the princes nobody remembers. And the consequences, they hit like a domino chain falling for 150 years straight. Ready? Let's see. It all starts with Arthur Tudor. Yes, Arthur. The brother Henry VIII replaced the Prince of Wales almost nobody talks about. When Arthur died at 15, his widow Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII. A love story? Not quite. Because that marriage, just that one marriage, became the spark that blew up Europe. Henry's obsession with getting a male heir made him question whether Catherine had really been a virgin when she married him. One doubt, one theological loophole. And suddenly, Henry breaks England away from the Catholic Church. That's right, Arthur's death leads directly to the English Reformation. England leaves Catholicism behind and the shockwaves shake the continent for centuries. Wild chain reaction. Huh? Do you think so? But hold on, because Arthur's ghost isn't done. Jump to the next generation. Edward VI, Henry's precious son, the boy he tore the world apart to get. Edward dies at 16, and his death is a grenade thrown straight into the Tudor throne room. Because Edward tears up the traditional line of succession before he dies. He crosses out both his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, and installs the quiet, unwilling Lady Jane Grey as heir. What happens next? Lady Jane Grey, the 16-year-old who'd rather be reading a book, becomes the 9 days queen. 9 days later, she's dethroned. Soon after, she's executed. A teenage casualty of a teenage king. Dark, right, and then England whiplashes again. Mary takes the throne and drags England back to Catholicism, with fireblood and what history calls the Marian persecutions. Thousands suffer the country fractures, fear spreads, and just when England adjusts, the pendulum swings again. Because Mary dies, Elizabeth the Free rises, and she pushes England firmly back to Protestantism. 3 religious earthquakes, 3 reversals, all triggered because Edward didn't live long enough to hold the throne steady. Imagine if he had. Do you think England would look the same today? Here's the twist nobody sees coming too. Princes Arthur and Edward, barely remembered, by most people shaped modern England more than Henry VIII ever did. If Arthur hadn't died young, Henry would never have broken from Rome. If Edward hadn't died early, Mary wouldn't have reversed the faith, and Elizabeth wouldn't have had to flip it back again. Every shift in English religion, every act of rebellion, every execution, all of it traces back to these 2 boys. One who died before he ruled, one who ruled before he lived, and together they forged the England we know today. Crazy chain of events, right? History isn't just written by kings, sometimes it's rewritten by ghosts. In the end, the story of Arthur Edward and the entire Tudor line leaves us with a strange, almost haunting truth. Sometimes the greatest shifts in history don't come from battles or treaties or grand acts of power, but from the silent, fragile heartbeat of a single child. Arthur's death reshaped a continent. Edward's fear reshaped a monarchy. And Henry's desperate search for a son reshaped the very soul of England. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if Arthur had lived? England might have remained Catholic. No Anne Boleyn, no Reformation, no Elizabethan Golden Age. And what if Edward hadn't panicked on his deathbed? Would Lady Jane Grey have lived a quiet life instead of becoming a tragic 9-day footnote in history? Tiny changes, massive consequences. Do you ever think about that? Because history isn't just kings and queens. It's a chain reaction of what ifs we'll never fully answer. But maybe that's why these stories stay with us. They remind us how fragile power is, how accidental destiny can be, and how one life can tilt the world. If you want to keep exploring these hidden turning points of history, stick around. There's a lot more waiting beneath the surface.
When you look at Arthur, Henry, and Edward, it's clear none of them got the life they were meant for. Power didn't save them. It trapped them. And it makes you wonder, were their choices mistakes or the only options they had? If you were Henry, scared of leaving no heir, would you have broken from Rome? If you were Edward, dying young, would you change the line of succession? Let's see. And hey, their story isn't just in the past. There's a Prince of Wales still alive today. Do you know who he is? Stick around for the next episode. History's about to get even more interesting.